Hello, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I feel like Walter Cronkite saying that. Hello, wherever you are in the world today. It's wonderful to see you. Okay, well, today we have another special presentation. Aren't they all special and wonderful? And so thank you for being here. Today, the presentation will be on neurodivergence in law and the importance of advanced communication in legal and neutral practice. That said, our speaker today is Christina Hough out of who's in San Diego, California. So, but before we get going with that, and before I introduce Christina, let's talk numbers and the amount of money that we have been told about. The people have told us they've donated to food banks around the world since May of 2020. The total today is, as of today, $581,738.45. This is just so amazing. Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being so generous. Love your claps and raised hands. Thank you. And of course, the millions of meals that have been served around the world. Those folks, thank you as well. And so we keep on going. I keep saying the last few weeks, I can see 600,000 in our mirror here coming up, not really in the rearview mirror, but in the future coming up through the windshield. So sooner than later this summer, we will pass that $600,000 number. That said, let's move on to the presentation today. Christina Hough is Vice President membership of the San Diego Paralegal Association. And the food bank she's designated is the San Diego Food Bank. Natalie will put the link in the chat for us. The topic is near and dear to Christina's heart. She's a seasoned legal paraprofessional, having worked as a senior paralegal on the in-house litigation team of a Fortune 10 company and a legal secretary on the business trials team at an AmLaw 50 firm, among her many prior roles. She has 20 years of experience working as a member of pre-litigation and litigation teams at small businesses, large enterprises, and law firms of varying sizes and specialties. She has extensive experience in general civil litigation matters, including personal injury, products liability, premises liability, construction defect, pharmacy, administrative law, small claims, and many other specialized areas of law. She's also argued in court trials before small claims courts in various jurisdictions throughout the Western United States, and as a result has obtained numerous defense verdicts on behalf of the Fortune 10 company that she had worked for. She earned her bachelor's degree in public administration from Southern New Hampshire University, graduating summa cum laude, and as a distinguished scholar with a 4.0 GPA. She received her paralegal certificate with honors from the University of San Diego Paralegal Program, the very first paralegal program in the United States to receive American Bar Association approval. In 2023, Christina completed her first year of law school at the University of San Diego School of Law and participated in their summer program at their center in Madrid, Spain. She is a member of many organizations and recently received recognition for 2022 inaugural Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Educational Conference for the National Association of Legal Assistants affiliates. She has also been recognized by the San Diego Business Journal as a woman of influence in law in 2023. So with all those accolades, we look forward to hearing Christina today talk to us about, life in the real world, human beings that we are. So Christina, the floor is yours. If you would tell us a little bit about your chosen food bank first, and then launch into your presentation, that would be great. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean, for the lovely introduction. I appreciate that. So my food bank of choice is the San Diego Food Bank in They serve over 400,000 people here in San Diego County each month and have distributed over 44 million pounds of food. And they partner with nearly 500 nonprofits across the county to distribute food and provide nutritious food to individuals and families. So any donations to this organization would be greatly appreciated. Let's see if I could share my screen with you. Am I already sharing my screen? Oh, here we go. All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. So as you can see, we are going to talk about neurodiversity in law and the importance of advanced communication in legal and neutral practice. So as Jean mentioned in the lovely intro, I have been working in the legal field for just over 22 years now. And I personally received a late diagnosis of ADHD when I was 40 years old in April 2023 of last year. So in January 2022, I was diagnosed with PTSD, which falls under the neurodiverse umbrella of conditions. And I didn't receive my diagnosis, unfortunately, until the very end of 1L year. And had I received a diagnosis sooner, I could have requested accommodations that may have improved my academic performance. Now, I did fine. I did okay, but I feel I definitely could have done better, and I believe that that was reflected in when I attended the study abroad program in Madrid, Spain, because my performance significantly improved due to the reduced class sizes and more frequent access to the law professors. And in one of those courses, which was international internet and IP law, I actually received the highest grade, which was a surprise to me because I never thought I would receive the highest grade in one of my classes. So it just goes to show you that if you are given the right environment, that you can exceed your own expectations. Now, what does neurodivergent mean? So it's an umbrella term. It's considered a non-medical term, but it can include autism, ADHD, PTSD, post-concussive syndrome, and various other conditions that fall under that umbrella. And neurodivergent individuals' brains process information differently than typical individuals. So neurodiversity example, is similar to it sounds similar to neurodivergent, but neurodiversity is all of humankind, and it's describes the range of neurologic functioning across the whole entire population. So certain categories of neurodivergence are kind of broken down to help people better understand the different types of conditions that fall. Developmental, for example, is autism and ADHD. Mental illness can include bipolar and anxiety disorders, and acquired mental illness, which kind of, as the name implies, is something that occurs after birth, right? There's a trauma or some other thing that causes someone's neurologic processing to change. So that's PTSD, post-concussion syndrome, and other trauma disorders. And individuals with trauma disorders often experience heightened sensitivity and empathy and develop crisis response skills, which can present themselves as both strengths and struggles. So there's a big universe of neurodiversity that spans a number of conditions. And these are numbers for the whole population is estimated. Autism, 1 to 2% of the population. And interestingly, 50 to 70% of people with autism also have ADHD. And just a little background on that. My son is autistic, and we got a late diagnosis. And so that kind of spiked my interest in these kinds of conditions, and it led to me seeking my own diagnosis, because I learned more and more after speaking with various individuals with autism and ADHD about what kind of their symptoms are, what things, for example, trigger them. And so I sought a diagnosis for myself, and I had no idea, you know, I didn't even know what neurodiversity was when I was a kid, for example, growing up. But had I known it, it could have, you know, possibly changed the trajectory of my life, right? Um, ADHD, 5% of the population has ADHD. Dyscalculia, it affects number comprehension and math. Dyslexia affects reading and spelling. 10% of the population is estimated to have dyslexia. Dyspraxia affects movement and coordination. Tourette syndrome is another example. PTSD, this is an interesting statistic that I got from a presentation that was given by Ajit Dodani at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners last week, that before 2019, there were approximately 3.5% of the population diagnosed with PTSD, and post-COVID, up to 26% of the population is showing signs of PTSD. And most of those individuals have not sought help for the symptoms that they're experiencing. So there's a natural communication gap in neurodivergent individuals versus neurotypical individuals. So they essentially speak different languages because they express themselves in different ways. And it's important to be open-minded and to understand that everyone has an opportunity to be heard and solutions can be reached with everyone in mind. So some of the interesting numbers are out there. As many as 1 in 7 individuals identifies as neurodivergent. That statistic was taken from mediate.com. It's estimated that 15 to 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. So that's literally billions of people, because we have a population of over 8 billion in the world today. And if it's 20%, that's over, you know, 2.5 billion people that are neurodivergent. It's estimated that by 2027, 25% of Fortune 500 companies will actively recruit neurodiverse talent to impact business performance, because it's shown that diversity in the corporate world leads to corporate success. And this is a statistic from the ABA that up to 12.5% of attorneys have ADHD. So neurodivergents have diverse perspectives and unique ideas and may improve outcomes because of their experiences. So for me, for example, being undiagnosed didn't prevent me from having a successful career in law. And my performance reviews were always stellar, and I improved processes in nearly every legal setting in which I worked. For example, I was at a firm for almost 10 years, and a lot of the attorneys would say, go talk to Christina. She'll tell you how to do it, right? And still to this day, I keep touch with many of my former colleagues, and you know, we're able to bounce ideas off of each other because we understand that we have different perspectives and come from different life experiences. So neurodiversity in legal settings. So whether you're a paralegal, an attorney, or neutral, you've probably had experiences with people that are neurodivergent, whether you consciously recognized it or not. So it significantly influences mediation, because your perspective on something may not be the same as someone else's. The way that you process information may not be the same as someone else's. Different people have different responses to sensory inputs, for example. For example, the lighting in a room can impact somebody's mood. You know, access to, for example, fidgets, which we'll get to later on another slide, can really help people focus. It's interesting because a lot of people that are neurodivergent have co-occurring neurodiverse traits. So, for example, as previously mentioned, people with autism, 50 to 70% of them also have ADHD. And each person's experience is impacted by their socioeconomic status, their upbringing, their individual state of health and well-being. So some neuro-inclusive considerations for legal settings, particularly depositions and mediations, is communication styles. You know, you may have experience with someone, and to you they're coming off as harsh or angry, or you know, some other, you know, non-favorable emotional state, right? But it could be because they aren't prepared for the conversation. And that's not because they don't want to be prepared. It's because they didn't get information far enough in advance to be able to adequately prepare for the mediation or the deposition. So for people, for example, deposition questions, if you present them in writing, you could get a better deposition out of it because the person has had a chance to think about it and adequately prepare. And someone who is neurodiverse really needs that prep time to think about things and process things. And here, for example, autistic person may struggle with metaphorical language, just kind of everyday phrases that people use and kind of take for granted may not be understood by someone with autism, because a lot of autistic thinking is very black and white. So if like, for example, the term beating a dead horse, right? An autistic person might think, well, why would you do that? They're not thinking about it's something that you've tried over and over again and you've gotten the same result, which is nowhere, And so avoiding those types of phrases is really important because it helps to streamline the conversation and maximize efficiency of the time. And also too, like emotional interpretation, neurodivergent people can have a difficult time understanding someone else's emotions. They have a difficult time expressing themselves sometimes. A lot of times people can come off as really intense, but it's because they're passionate about a subject and not necessarily because they're angry or frustrated or what have you. It's because they really feel deeply about the particular issue. Information processing. Time and information can be processed differently by a neurodivergent. Like lengthy meetings can lead to difficulty focusing on specific topics, right? So for a deposition, for example, might be a PMK deposition where you're addressing 5 different issues, but because it's going at length, that other person might bring other issues into it because they've spent too much time on one particular issue. Visuals and charts can be really helpful for someone who's neurodivergent. Reading huge blocks of text isn't helpful, which I know is kind of hard to avoid in this setting, in a legal setting, but bullet points and summaries can really help somebody in that situation. Sensory processing, which we kind of touched upon, can impact someone's comfort and concentration. So, you have your 5 senses, right? So, for example, if the room is too hot or too cold, it can really distract someone who's neurodivergent. If there's too bright of lights in the room, it can be very distracting and change, the person's emotional state or perspective. So people need to be allowed time to decompress, right? So what ways to help those things are fidgets. We'll kind of go into it on another slide, doodling and the like. And emotional responses may be different, so you could have 2 different people, one neurodivergent, one neurotypical, and they may have completely different responses to the same stimuli or to the same information. And a neurotypical person's expectations for communication may be different, than someone else's. Someone may appear as very intense, to the average person, but they are not accustomed to, this learned behavior that we have in society where we, you do this, you say, please, thank you, you say that comes natural to a neurotypical person, but it's very unnatural to someone who might be neurodivergent. So social interaction and rapport building is very important for someone who is neurodivergent because they may be distrusting of people because of their lived experiences. So it's important to be able to find common ground and, build a rapport with somebody. And you can establish clearer expectations and offer someone reassurance, a supportive, non-judgmental space for a mediation setting, for example. frequent breaks may be necessary for somebody that is neurodivergent. So patience and pacing, that goes along with that. So you might need to, take a break every, 15 minutes so that that person can process what's happened, because people have learning differences. So some people better process information visually, some people process it auditorily, some people like to put their hands on a piece of paper, so it really just depends on a individual's preferences and how they best process information. You know, for example, calculators, process maps, and other tools that helps them organize information. So stress management is a big one. And that's something that I think the legal field in general struggles with, is managing stress and time. And there's so much expected of you. You work so many hours are expected each month, especially if you're working in a billable setting. And, so you have that stress, but for someone who is neurodiverse, their stress is heightened because of their experiences and their natural wiring of their brain, or wiring that is acquired after a traumatic event. And so anything that is within control of some sort of someone who is neurodiverse is important, because it helps not only them regulate their emotions and their state, but it helps the overall process of a mediation or a deposition, because they can say, hey, I need a break, or hey, I need to go have a snack, or whatever it happens to be for that particular individual. So stimming is common among people that are neurodivergent. Examples can include doodling, and I've seen many attorneys doodle during deposition or client meetings, or even mediations, or even, sitting at the desk in a courtroom. And that includes pens or pencils, doodling on piece of paper, people playing with their jewelry. It helps them to refocus what they're thinking about, what's going on in the courtroom or in the mediation. And the waiting game is never fun for anybody. So it helps reduce boredom, reduce overload with the situation, regulate emotion, and it helps people express their feelings better. So physical objects can help the brain focus and process information more quickly. Let's see here. Okay, so where might we encounter someone who's neurodivergent? The short answer is everywhere. Literally everywhere. You might come across someone who's neurodivergent every day and you not even realize it. So, for example, in civil litigation, personal injury, traumatic brain injury, someone with a traumatic brain injury might have a neurological function that is atypical of the average individual. They might have PTSD from having witnessed an event or experienced an event. Criminal, that could be survivors of crime, or it can be some of the accused. Their accused often have conditions that affect their mental health status. Immigration, asylees and refugees, especially from war-torn or high crime regions. Education or special education, neurodivergent students and their parents and caregivers have 504s or IEPs. And these are accommodations that are given to students that need them. For example, my son was able to have a 5-minute break if he needed to in each of his classes, because it helped him calm down. He had sensory processing, for example, issues with people chattering in class. And so it was really hard for him to focus and concentrate hearing this chatter, because his brain hears it on a level that other people don't. All right. So I have a question from Daniel saying, how do you identify someone who is neurodivergent, and how can you ask without offending someone? So for me personally, I personally don't get offended if someone has a question about me being neurodivergent, but it's going to be different for every individual. So I think what you can do is, what is making you identify someone as neurodivergent, number one, and see, you could do a quick Google search and go to, Harvard Business Review or Forbes Health or, even WebMD, and kind of look at these symptoms that you're recognizing and see what conditions might, you know, that person might have, right? Of course, we are not medical doctors unless you have an MD, or you're a clinical psychologist who is qualified to diagnose those conditions. But you can politely make a suggestion. Hey, have you considered seeing a doctor for this? For example, heightened anxiety that I think you're experiencing. You know, um, Personally, in my experience, a lot of people that are neurodivergent are not easily offended when it comes to their neurodivergent conditions, but that may not be the same for every person. So it really just depends on the individual. Um, and then in legal and neutral practice, you'll come and see people of all sorts, that are neurodivergent. As mentioned on a previous slide, 12.5% of attorneys are estimated to have ADHD, right? So that's a condition. And I'm quite sure that many more attorneys have some sort of anxiety disorder that is associated with their practice or things that are going on in their personal lives, so it really just depends on the person and the environment. But for example, if it's somebody that you care about, and you are curious if they might be neurodivergent, you can have a candid conversation with them and talk about it, and you can even relate your own experiences with the condition that you think that they might have, right? So anxiety is a big one in the legal industry. We're always trying to put out fires, right? Especially if you're in a practice that has a high motion practice, right? Because you're always trying to meet that motion deadline. You're always trying to meet that opposition deadline, get the reply in, right? And this is a good point for the advanced communication, because if you file a motion and you don't get the opposition in a timely manner, you're scrambling to prepare your reply, right? And so that's what it's like, for example, for someone who's neurodivergent, because they're always scrambling to get that piece of information that they need to put on their case, right? Or to, address a question in a meeting or in a deposition, because they need time to process the information. And so getting something at the last minute, which is what it feels like, doesn't help the process. So that's why it's important. For example, a lot of attorneys and neutrals would make arrangements to have briefs in advance of a meeting or a deposition. But for someone, for example, that has PTSD and the subject of the mediation is because of the incident that caused their PTSD, they might need more time to process that information. So getting a brief to them the day before isn't really conducive or to finding a resolution at the mediation the following day, because they need to be able to process and calm down and move on so that they can try to resolve their case. Let's see here. All right, so this is a neuroinclusive meeting checklist that I adapted from Dr. Ludmila Proslova, who is a autistic research scientist and doctor, or research scientist and professor. And she really breaks down things. And here's her book right here, which I have as recommended reading for at the end of our presentation here. But it's called The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work. And it talks about various things that you can do in the professional world to kind of help make it more inclusive for someone who's neurodivergent. So a clear agenda, for example. I know that a lot of attorneys don't necessarily prepare agendas for client meetings, but if you know that your client is neurodivergent, that can be extremely helpful for you to get the information that you need out of that meeting, right? So it helps set the expectations for the client or the witness or whoever it happens to be, and it avoids surprises for them. So if there's something, if you don't have an agenda and you bring something up and that person, for example, has PTSD for whatever reason, it can be very triggering and upsetting for them because they don't know, they didn't expect that that was going to happen, right? So they may need a lot more time, and you're not maximizing your time in your meeting if they're reacting to a surprise, right? For legal practice, client meetings, written agenda in advance, super important. But it not only for you, but for your client. That way you can make sure that the client knows what's going to be addressed, and you can make sure that as you're going through the meeting, you're checking off everything that you need to address. The same thing for depositions. Offering the questions in advance for someone who is neurodivergent is so helpful. And not only will it help reduce the amount of time that you have to spend in the deposition itself, but we know that in California in particular, you're limited to 7 hours in deposition, right? So if you have a lot of subject matter to get through, this can be really helpful for someone who is neurodivergent. And as mentioned before, briefs in advance, even if the neutral has made them optional, is really important for someone who is neurodivergent because it gives them time to process the information, and it may even help you resolve the matter sooner because that person has time to process the information, and maybe the way that you argued it in your brief makes them, come off the ledge a little bit when it comes to what they're expecting as a settlement. Keep it efficient, pre-planning, time sensitive. The shorter the better. I know that mediations tend to be at least a half day or a long day, or full 8-hour day, for example, and you might have multiple sessions. But for someone who's neurodivergent, it's the shorter the better, right? So maybe you do 3 hours and maybe you do 4 hours. But a full day is going to be extremely draining for somebody that is neurodivergent. Provide pre-reads well in advance. So summaries and bullet points. Some people that are neurodivergent need to read and reread things over and over again to understand them. So another important aspect of brief writing, reasonable adjustments. So this is something that's very easy. You can ask your client and opposing counsel if any attendees need accommodations. And those accommodations could be frequent breaks. They could be placements of seats. For example, someone who's neurodivergent may not want to be facing a window that has bright light coming out of it because that can impact their ability to focus. Fidgets are important. Water, food, medication, frequent access to restrooms, etc. Different learning styles, as previously mentioned, may require information to be conveyed in more than one way. Visuals over words, for example. So you might have a whole paragraph that talks about, damages in a case, but you could do a pie chart that shows, here's what I want for general damages, or special damages, or what have you. A medical, here's what I want for medical reimbursement. It just depends on the nature of the case, but that can be really helpful for someone who is neurodivergent to help them process the information. And this is something that's already been common in the legal field for a long time, is using plain language, right? But for example, the legal world still uses a lot of Latin terms, right? And someone who's not in the legal field may not be, familiar with those Latin terms. So it may be better just to express it in plain language. And there are terms that people often use that may be considered offensive to some audiences, So for example, in autism, autistic people prefer to be referred to as autistic rather than a person with autism. And that's because you're putting the person first and not the condition, right? So that's something that's very preferred amongst autistic adults. Encouraging participation. So oftentimes you can have one person dominating a conversation during a meeting or a mediation, right? And so it's really important to be able to allow everybody to say their piece, right? But in a way that gives everybody a sufficient amount of time to say what they need to say. Sometimes neurodivergent individuals have a difficult time expressing themselves, right? So it could be it makes sense to them, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to someone who's neurotypical. So that can be something, and you may need to seek clarification on what someone's trying to say because of that. Making people feel encouraged and welcome, or setting, for example, ground rules for a mediation or deposition can be super important for a neurodivergent person. Considering timers, for example, like you could say, okay, you have 5 minutes to plead your case, right? And then the next person can have 5 minutes to plead their case, right? And then you can come back and kind of switch back and forth so that people are being allotted equal amounts of time to say why they should get what they get or why they shouldn't get what they shouldn't get, right? And one thing to always remember is that, the world was not built with neurodivergent people in mind. So something that is absolutely normal to you may be totally out of left wing to someone who isn't built that way, right? So it's important to, balance their experience and your experience, right? And you may find, for example, you may find yourself getting frustrated with someone who's neurodivergent, and that's a good time to take a break, because then you can say, okay, well, maybe they didn't mean it the way that I'm interpreting it, right? So that's something that's really very important to think about when you're dealing with people that are neurodivergent, and vice versa for people that are neurodivergent. They may not understand why someone is thinking a certain way. So it's important to try to come to a medium where you can both understand each other. So promoting a sense of psychological safety is super important for someone who's neurodivergent, because oftentimes their ideas are not given the weight that they feel that is there. And maybe it's not, being understood in the way that it's intended. And so if you can seek clarification, that's really, really important. Value learning over perfection, right? So you want to make clear the aim of the meeting is to learn and grow and solve problems, not to achieve perfection, right? And mistakes are always opportunities for learning and growth. Follow-up is super important for someone who is neurodivergent, because it tells them that you heard what they said and that you may want to make them comfortable and that you really are interested in resolving the issue, right? So I know that mediators often do this anyway, but it's good to reinforce, is to send out a summary of discussion points, decisions made, and the next steps. For example, you may have settled on one issue, but not another issue. And so the focus will be the other issue, right? And engaging in continuous feedback helps you identify issues that can be improved in future sessions, whether it be a second mediation or a second deposition session or a second client meeting. You want to make sure that all that are involved are accommodated and feel welcomed and involved in the process. So these are some books that I highly recommend. This is the one that I held up, The Canary Code. Really great book, and it talks about different checklists for different types of meetings. For example, hybrid meetings, virtual meetings, and just meetings in general to help, provide a more inclusive environment for someone who might be neurodivergent. The Waymakers is an excellent book by Tara J. Frank, and it's really packed with lots of golden nuggets of information in different ways that people can be more inclusive in the business space and in their personal lives. And then, especially when you're dealing with someone who has PTSD or post-concussive syndrome or any other sort of kind of even anxiety disorder, The Body Keeps the Score is a great book because it talks about how our body holds on to information long after we've experienced things. All righty. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Christina. So much of that can be translated into, like you said, the mediation sessions and all. Before we take down the PowerPoint, everyone, this Christina's information is there in case you're interested in reaching out to her. And so other than that, why don't we take that down so it's easier to see each other? Turn that off then, Christina, or stop sharing. Yeah. There we go. There we go. Thinking of this in terms of the mediator, which most of these people here are probably mediators, arbitrators, a wide variety of positions across the legal spectrum. What sort of clues would you look for in a mediation, or, in a meeting, but in a mediation session, to even just tell yourself, oh, maybe I need to communicate with this person differently, maybe to change things up?
Well, for example, eye contact can be difficult for people with autism, for example, people that are autistic can be very difficult. And so it may seem like they are not paying attention when they actually are. So that can be an indicator, for example, if you feel like someone isn't looking you in the eye, right? And it's because people with autism or people that are autistic often feel uncomfortable looking people in the eye. And it's not because they are not interested in getting to know you. It's because it's literally like a visceral physical response in their body that makes them uncomfortable, for example. Another thing is doodling and fidgeting, right? That's someone that's trying to refocus. And you can, ask them questions and try to, see if they need clarification on anything, right? So, but a lot of times you might just give them a couple of seconds to do that doodling or fidgeting, and then ask them and reassure them, hey, I just want to make sure that you understand the information that's been presented. Please let me know, right? Is there anything else that we can elaborate on to help you process this information, right? So I think too, in the legal setting, you're thrown so much information all the time. And so sometimes it can be difficult, for example, to keep things in order or keep things organized. And for someone with a neurodivergent brain, it's literally chaos all the time, right? Like, for example, me, I'm here giving this presentation, right? But I'm thinking about 40 other things right now too, right? So it can be very, very and it's not intentional. It's just the way that the brain works, right? So, for example, I'm thinking, okay, what's my son doing right now, right? He just graduated high school. He's doesn't have a job right now. He's not going to college in the fall, like what is he doing, right? So it just depends on the person and what's going on. But that's the thing, is it's hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes, especially when you're not neurodivergent, but you can ask questions that help elicit information that keeps you more informed about what that person is thinking, or whether they need clarification about something. For example, like in a personal injury case, it could be, some person may have had, 5 different types of treatment for something, right? But maybe someone who's neurodivergent doesn't quite understand, what that treatment entails. So you might need to elaborate on that so that they have a better understanding, and maybe elaborating on that gives them a better understanding of why someone's seeking a certain amount of damages or what have you, right?
Okay, Anne, you have a question?
Yes, I do. First, I want to thank you, Christina, for this excellent presentation, and the way that you have done your presentation that helps anyone, I think, with any kind of, no matter how we learn, it's so presentable. I've done a number of sessions going into schoolrooms as an administrative law judge and talk about working on cases involving special education. And I tell the young students, because it could be elementary school, that means we learn in different ways. So I want to thank you for that. So my I have a number of thoughts, and you are in a way a pioneer in bringing this into not just our profession, but to a lot of different professions, and helping people. How do you get the best possible outcome if you don't understand a population that simply learns differently or approaches things differently? And how do you get the best people? You mentioned corporations hiring because diversity enhances their goals. And how do we get people to do that? Of course, the thought is also how valuable your type of presentation would be in school curriculum. And again, I'm thinking even way before law school or anything like that. And I certainly hope, just as it took years and years and years in terms of special education to make that kind of breakthrough, that we will see that happen on school, on the level of the schools, that it's simply a kind of required part of any kind of curriculum. So that's not really just a question. I know you're probably working on all of these things, and but the other thing is there are some who believe that neurodiversity should be considered in a way as a previously excluded class, and how we help to sensitize people to that, especially when we're saying you can't always see something, and how do we become more sensitive to that as a whole?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you stated what you have, and that's a great I have a great example for you, because my son transferred to a new school in his junior year of high school. He just graduated last week, and at the beginning of this school year, he had a weight training teacher who had zero experience with special education students, and she had no desire to learn about it. And that was really disheartening for me as a parent, right? Because I want the best for my son, right? And so I had a meeting with the vice principal and his caseworker and other teachers that he had. And one of the things was they were all in agreement that this teacher had no desire to learn how to, you know, deal with kids that had special needs, and it's so important for that attitude to change, because it used to be 1 in 59 kids about 10 years ago. 1 in 59 kids was being diagnosed with some level autism spectrum disorder, and now it's 1 in 37 kids. And the incidences of neurodivergent diagnoses continues to increase year after year. And so it's so important that not just people that will be working with neurodivergence, but I think the general population becomes sensitized to these students, because it's not going away, and it's only becoming more more I guess, I don't want to say more popular, but more occurrences of neurodivergence is happening, So it's really, really important that we learn to accept other people, one, for their uniqueness in their neurodivergence, but also two, when we give everybody a voice and a place at the table, it improves outcomes overall, because that person may be thinking something that maybe is not a solution for you, but it's a solution for someone else who is neurodivergent, right? So we want to be able to be as inclusive as possible for all populations, but in neurodivergence in particular, often have very bad experiences in work environments, in school, in other settings, because they are often outcast. They are often feel like the black sheep, right? And so, it's really unfortunate. And a lot of people can be very dismissive of someone that's neurodivergent, and so that makes makes someone not feel valued, and it can impact their self-esteem, which doesn't help anybody, right? So the more that we are open to neurodiversity and listening to people that are neurodivergent and really trying to understand them, the better we will be as a society overall, and the more solutions will happen. And so important. So I really appreciate you putting that information out there and allowing me to talk about it and respond to it.
If I could just add one more, and I don't want to hog Christina, and I know there's a comment in the chat also, but and you had mentioned especially about the eye contact, and that's something that fortunately we began years ago in the legal profession. People try to make a breakthrough in training, you know, judges on assessment of credibility. It does not mean someone is lying when they cannot have eye contact with you. So it was put in the cultural context, but now we have just another context. That's just something that would make people so uncomfortable. And
Right.
the other thing is that, you know, you were asked about how, you know, could you converse with somebody to ask them about their issues and so on. I remember as an administrative law judge, prior to a hearing, someone had approached me and indicated that she was hard of hearing, and would I mention, and I said, thank you for bringing that to my attention. So before we began the proceeding, I said, someone has indicated there's some difficulty in hearing, and you couldn't, it's not a setting where you could do something about that, but to ask people to be cognizant of that, and then not having to identify somebody. I find it difficult when somebody has to be the one to say, okay, you need to do this and make your adjustment because I have that need, rather than let's be cognizant of this for anyone that it might affect.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, is that, you know, someone who's neurodivergent might not feel comfortable disclosing that, right? So I think, well, as you said, saying someone, you know, would like you to project your voice, for example, in a courtroom, because they're hard of hearing, that gives them the anonymity, but it also gives them the accommodation of everyone being cognizant that someone is hard of hearing. Right. So, and that could be the same thing. Like you can, for example, if you have one side in a mediation that, you know, says, well, I need the lighting to be dimmed in a room, right? Because it impacts my ability to focus. You know, that doesn't necessarily have to be something that's revealed to everybody who's participating in the mediation, right? But you know, there are a lot of kind of sensory sensitivities that people that are neurodivergent have. For example, even myself, I'm sitting here at my desk and I have the light above my desk on for this meeting, but as soon as this meeting's over, I'm going to turn it off. You know, because it's not, you know, it doesn't help me in any way to have the light above me, because I have another light that's kind of off to the side that allows me sufficient lighting to see my monitors, right? So each person is going to be different, and it's not something that necessarily is going to impact people that aren't neurodivergent, right? I mean, if you dim the lighting a bit, it's probably not going to affect everybody else that much, right? So I think it's important to, you know, keep those things in mind. Let's see, we have George says, ever feel like you, the mediator, is the one who's neurodivergent? I'm thinking of times when we are working in multicultural situations or with teenagers whose communication patterns are often quite different from someone quite older. And that is so true. That is so true. And I think every generation kind of has its like buzzwords and slang, you know, and this kind of alternate language that we don't necessarily understand, right? So both of my kids use interesting words and terms that is a part of their generation that I'm like, why do you say that? And to me, it just sounds so like unnecessary, but that's the way that the kids talk, right? So, you know, that could be definitely true. And I think one thing too is, you know, just in a professional setting generally, people that are neurodivergent are very good workers. And oftentimes they're dismissed, right? Because before they even get an opportunity to get the job, because they're not making eye contact in an interview, for example, right? So some neurodivergents, especially autistics, prefer to do interviews in like a chat form, right? And there have been more companies that are more accommodating to that because it doesn't require the person being interviewed to look somebody in the eye, even though that they are perfectly capable of performing the job. People will dismiss them because they're not looking them in the eye, you know? So those are things to keep in mind. Also, people that are neurodivergent are extremely great at recognizing patterns, you know, and that was something I'm really good at as a paralegal, is recognizing patterns in data and information in medical records or correspondence or whatever the, you know, set of documents happens to be. Is like, okay, and also recognizing discrepancies in information, you know. So it's like I have a case I'm working on right now where it's a labor and employment case, and someone could say, oh, you know, I did this at this time, and it's like, oh, well, the data here shows something else, right? So it just kind of depends on the case, but that's one thing that neurodivergents are really great at, is recognizing, and especially if it's a topic of interest, it's something that interests them, they are really good at remembering information and data. Like in the course of my career, you know, working with attorneys, you know, preparing for trial, preparing medical record summaries, deposition summaries, you know, an attorney could come up to me and say, where's that piece of information? Oh, it's right here, you know, because it's like in my mind, because I like working on a case from start to finish, and I like knowing where everything is. I like organizing information. So those are tools that are very, you know, helpful for this industry in particular. So um, just something to keep in mind when you are hiring people and interviewing people, is that, you know, your best candidate may be someone who's neurodivergent, who isn't the best at interviewing, but maybe their performance in the work setting is stellar. So it's just something to think about.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, I can think back on different situations where maybe some of the interaction was happening, you know, because of different ways of people looking at things. I would think that all this information will be helpful to us in mediations, arbitrations, general life, whether it's work or personal, you know. So thank you so much, Christina. This has been fascinating.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And I would encourage everyone who might be able to make a donation, large or small, to the San Diego Food Bank or the food bank of your choice. And if you'd be so kind as to let Natalie know how much the donation is. She keeps a running total, totally anonymously, but that running total, and that would be fantastic. We love seeing that number get larger every week. And so thank you again all for being here, for your generosity. Thank you, Christina, for the generosity of your time and your thought processes here with us. And we'll see you next week, same time. Different Zoom link.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We are complete with that.